Okay, welcome back. This is part 3 of my lecture on representation, and when we last left off, I was talking about how each of these images is, in slightly different ways, far more unreal than they actually claim to be. And I was finishing up just talking about the Cindy Sherman right here, and how much this photograph is really kind of set up and staged, and is far less natural or real than it creates the impression of being. So, what is truthful? You know, when we talk about realism, oftentimes the students try to define what they mean when they say that a painting is realistic. They often come up with the idea that a realistic painting is truthful, that it has truth to it, which is ironic in a way because the attempt at realism or the attempt at a naturalistic representation is by its very definition usually untruthful, a deceit, in that you're trying to make something look like a real thing when it is not the real thing. A good example of that would be this Jeff Koons right here, which is an incredibly faithful representation of a inflatable mylar bunny kind of thing, where he took an actual inflatable mylar bunny, and I think he through casting and scaled up a little bit and created an exact replica cast, and then cast that in this chrome aluminum, super smooth, so that it's as shiny as if it was mylar. And so it is a very, very exact representation in a way, and because of that, it is an extremely unreal thing. It's a very untruthful thing, because it is not actually a mylar bunny. It's actually a very heavy cast aluminum piece of sculpture, so that its similarity to the thing that it's trying to represent, it's very, very good, very close to the real thing similarity, makes it all the more deceptive and untruthful. And this sunflower seeds piece here by Ai Weiwei also gets at that same idea, gets at the idea of representation on a number of levels. Let me just tell you a little bit about this piece. So in this piece, what he decided to do was he decided to make an installation where he filled a large room, like this room at the Tate Modern in London, to fill a large room with sunflower seeds, so that they are about a foot tall on the floor, and that you're walking across a floor of sunflower seeds. Why, may you ask? Well, it's a piece that's about the relationship between China and culture and art. And what you may not know is that in Maoist China during the Great Leap Forwards, Mao often referred to himself as like the sun to China, and that China was like the sunflower, that it would turn to him, follow him whichever way he went. And so Ai Weiwei has kind of turned that metaphor on its head by then casting China as the sunflower seeds, as being this, like, playing also on the idea that China is so populous, so that there are so many sunflower seeds, way too many than you could count, and playing on this idea of the type of loyalty that Mao was looking for, and whether that is really the type of loyalty that a state should ask from its citizen. And then all of this is heightened, the irony of this is heightened by the fact that Ai Weiwei actually, that these are not real sunflower seeds, that they are fake sunflower seeds. They are each one made out of ceramics, each one cast out of ceramic slip, but then each one is hand painted. And in fact, he hired an entire Chinese village for years. That's all the people of the village did. They all worked on this one project, painting these handmade sunflower seeds. And so, as a representation, the individual sunflower seeds are very, very good representations. They feel quite accurate in a way, but they are also very deceitful in that they are not actually real sunflower seeds. But at the same time, the representation is a fantastic representation about the history of Chinese politics, and about the idea of loyalty and faithfulness in Chinese politics, and the idea of the power of numbers that's kind of inherent in a lot of Chinese thinking. The idea that, just through the sheer volume of people, that they have a certain power. All of that is represented in this piece, although obliquely. So, one of the points I hope you get from this talk is that representation is always biased, and that representation is not only measured in terms of, well, how close to what I think is real, Lucy. It is representation is often more interesting based on how it deviates from what we see than it is interesting based on how faithful it is to what we see. And I think you can see that out of each of these images. I want to end with just a couple of last points. This is probably my last point I want to make about representation in the more general abstract sense. I just want you to really think about this piece, and in what ways is it an incredibly excellent representation, and in what ways does it seem to be a very bad representation. I think for a lot of students it looks like terrible representation because it looks crude, amateurish, and childlike. But in terms of it being a representation of someone's point of view about themselves and about the world, I think it's a fantastic representation. I am a huge Philip Guston fan, so this is one of my favorite paintings. Last point I want to make has to getting back to where we started from, which was we started this whole topic talking about ancient Greece, the classical period, and I want to tell you a little bit of a story. In the building of the Parthenon, Parthenon was built by a number of architects, Ectinus and Callicrates, but also Phidias, who oversaw the whole project. But Phidias wasn't an architect, he was a sculptor. And he was responsible for overseeing the whole project, but also responsible for all the sculptures on the building, including the frieze on the outside of the building, and the pediment sculpture on both ends, and then the internal friezes. And on one of the internal friezes, someone noticed that some of the images in it looked very specific, and there was a scandal in Phidias's lifetime where people accused him of having put his own portrait in the frieze on the Parthenon. Now that would probably seem kind of odd to be a scandal, but for classical Greece, this was considered heretical. This was an act of an act against the gods to have put his portrait in the artwork representing the religious life of Athens. And there was a trial over this very issue. He was convicted, although I think he was convicted more having to do with basically what we would call money laundering. But nonetheless, it led to a huge scandal, both for him and also for his political patrons. And I want to contrast that attitude about portraiture compared to the Romans later, who had they were much more comfortable with the idea of exact portraiture in their art. One of the reasons for that is that the Romans had a tradition of wearing funerary masks, where they would make masks of the recently dead, like when someone had died and they were at the funeral, they would do a wax impression of that person's face and then make a cast from that. And then it was common for them to wear the masks of their dead ancestors at certain festivals through the year. And because of that, I think they were more comfortable with the idea. You can see here, it's a patrician, a aristocratic leader of Rome, and he has two portrait busts of his ancestors, and those portrait busts would have been made from death masks. So the Romans were much more comfortable with it. But even the Romans, in terms of their official art, especially the more and more that they were influenced by Greek art, they more and more adopted the notion that official portraits should not be actual portraits. So in this case, this is a portrait of Commodus, who was an emperor, but this portrait of Commodus is not really meant to look exactly like Commodus, only to reference him. So it's Commodus as Hercules. And it wasn't really until we came out of the other side of the Renaissance that we find a culture becoming as comfortable with portraiture as the early Romans were. And even still, you can see that there's a slight uncomfortableness. In fact, we're even, like this painting by Robert Campin, we're still not entirely certain whether it is actually a portrait, a self-portrait, or just a random head study, but there are many who believe it is. But I want you to kind of look at how this transition from this painting to this painting to this painting, how we are also seeing a certain aspect of confidence that the artist has in himself and in the idea of him representing himself. But I want to end by reminding you what we started with, which is, remember, even representations like this, even self-portraiture, it is still, all representation is idealism, all representation is illusion, and is in part deception. All right, thank you very much. That's the end of the lecture.